The Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute is driving bold policy solutions for a resilient Canadian agri-food system and building a stronger future for Canadian agriculture. Visit capi-icpa.com to discover how.
You're listening to the Ag Policy Connection, brought to you by Real Agriculture in partnership with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. We're connecting the dots between the people and the policies that shape agriculture and farming today and into the future.
Welcome to the Ag Policy Connection, a podcast where we talk about the big ideas and fresh thinking needed to solve the big challenges and seize the big opportunities facing Canadian agriculture and food. I'm one of your hosts, Tyler McCann, the Managing Director at the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. I've been working in ag policy and politics for 20 years, and I'm a policy wonk.
And I'm not, but I'm your other host, Elise Bigley, the Director of Strategic Projects at CAPI, Canada's agriculture and food think tank. In this podcast, we'll be talking to leaders across agriculture and food about their big ideas to create generational change in ag policy.
That's right, Elise. We think the time has come for ag policy to catch up with the changes happening on farms, in processing facilities, and across the system that produces food and more and gets it to customers in Canada and around the world. We are excited to work with Real Agriculture to bring some of the big ideas for change to you.
And with that, let's get started. So today we're joined by Carlo Dade, who is the Director of International Policy at the University of Calgary School of Public Policy. Carlo has extensive background in international public policy, having most recently served as the founder and director of Trade and Trade Infrastructure Policy Research Centre at the Canada West Foundation. Among other accomplishments, he contributed significantly to the development of a national trade infrastructure plan and the renewal of Canada's trade corridors. We're really excited to hear from him today. And Carlo, welcome to the Ag Policy Connection.
Well, thanks for having me, guys. We should note, too, that we just started up the only North America Research and Convening Initiative in Canada at the School of Public Policy. So, yes, if international trade wasn't enough, I've also taken on managing the only large-scale, long-term, there are other initiatives, but this is the only large-term, large-scale convening initiative on the North America relationship. And that touches on ag heavily.
Wow. So I take it you have a lot of free time, Carlo. So let's just jump right in. What's your big idea for us today?
Well, it's something that several of us in the ag community, certainly your co-host and I, have been discussing for a few years now. And that is a deeper understanding of the era of relative turmoil in international trade, the changing in the rules-based trade order, which is a phrase to which we've become numb, but just the reality that the changes in the U.S., the changes in the global rules-based order have necessitated a rethink, most obviously about how we engage the U.S. So using that as an analogy, I think everyone understands that we're not dealing with Bill Clinton, we're not dealing with Barack Obama, we're not dealing with the Bushes. So we need to adapt our thinking in the U.S., not for short-term changes, but for generational change in the U.S. And the analogy in ag thinking is that we're seeing something similar with the rules for global trade and certainly for agricultural trade. We've had periods of instability before, but this one seems different, not just by degree, but by an accumulation of degrees that make for a difference in kind. And because of that, we need to adapt new thinking and test new ideas. I would say not just thinking, but we need the active testing of new ideas. And so the big idea is a new Plan A for Canadian agricultural trade. That starts with the foundational understanding. It starts with the resources we have in Canada, including here in academia, and it goes out to thinking about how we enter an era of managed trade for agriculture.
Okay, great. I want to dive into that big idea and a little bit about what you said, especially the active testing of those new ideas and what that looks like. But first, I want to get an understanding of why do you have these ideas. So we want to hear about the journey that led you here. Can you tell us a bit about your career and experience in international public policy and trade policy?
Stumbled into it. But let's do that through agriculture. So You've got someone who grew up in Philadelphia, went to public high schools in Philadelphia, talking about ag policy. Well, actually, my journey with ag started back in public school in Philadelphia. My brothers were members of the Future Farmers of America. They attended Walter Biddle Saul Ag Vocational High School. So even in an urban school district like Philadelphia, we had an agricultural vocational high school. So I learned a lot from my brothers, but also just the environment. You think of an urban environment being separate, but that wasn't the case when I was growing up. Ag had a huge influence in the state and even in, one of the largest cities in the country, in an urban school district. Flash forward, when I left graduate school, I worked in international development, and that work in Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and the English-speaking Caribbean involved grassroots community development. So I've spent not just the past years on the prairies talking to farmers, but I was doing it decades before I came to Canada, working with Regroupement Paysano in Haiti, or campesino organizations in the Dominican Republic, farmers groups in the Caribbean. I joke that the only difference is whether or not you have tractors. In terms of the major issues. But at root, there are similarities with ag policy. So it's been a long-standing time spent in agriculture, both here on the prairies, but also foundational work with sort of the more grassroots elements of agriculture. And of course, in all these communities, it's not just food for self-sufficiency. Agricultural trade played a huge role, either in exporting or dealing with imports from other countries. So that's the background in ag in particular.
So Carlo, I want to go back to a minute to your time in Philadelphia. I don't think many Canadians fully appreciate Future Farmers of America and their presence at schools. And again, you talk about in urban settings. What do you think the kind of the benefit? I mean, the part of the benefit is we're talking to you today because of the FFA and that program, but kind of what impact do you think it has on urban Americans? Because there are some of these kind of touch points in urban areas through FFA programs.
Sure, I can comment on the period when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s. Obviously, things have changed. I think the school still exists back in Philly. Actually, I'm fairly sure it does. But it gave an awareness to the importance of agriculture, just as you had specialized schools in the arts. And it gave, the sense that the city cared about arts. You had an appreciation for the arts, the performing arts. You also had science and technology. But ag wasn't left behind. Ag was part of that conversation. Obviously, it wasn't front and center, but it was nonetheless present. So I think that lack of absence kept as a reminder of the importance of agriculture to the state and also to the city, food processing and other industries. But it gave us an awareness, not deep, profound, but at least it wasn't completely forgotten, which is what I see today. Especially in Canada and urban districts, you've lost that connection, as tenuous as that would be with one school. But still, I mean, you had public kids in Philly who were members of FFA. I mean, that's a pretty hard thing for some folks to wrap their mind around. But it just seemed normal to us growing up that would be the case.
Yeah. Do you think that should be replicated in Canada? I know we have organizations trying to do similar things, but it sounds like a very profound experience for you.
It was influential. I don't know how profound, but it certainly it was certainly there, and it was certainly in the makeup. And I think without that exposure, it would have been a longer journey, more difficult for me to appreciate ag and to do the work I did in international development. I think the approach in Canada would have to be different, both reflecting the fact that this is 2025, not the 70s. But education and our groups working on basic education. I've been to farms when school kids have shown up, just serendipitously, and watching the work that's done when you bring kids out of the city, new Canadians who come from even larger urban environments back home, maybe even more distant from agriculture, and you expose them. So I think simply exposing folks having the kids go out once or twice to understand where food comes from, the rural reality, would be a huge benefit to us in the ag community.
And Carlo, I'm curious how your starting point in development and international development work informs now your thinking about international relations, international trade, and the policy landscape.
So certainly, I understand, I think, both sides of the coin, the exporters and importers. I have a developing country perspective on international trade. If you spend a lot of time with absolute poverty, and let me be clear, we do not have absolute poverty in Canada, as bad as our poverty is in certain communities. It is not absolute poverty. They're not communities where you're going to go back and know people that you're seeing today will be dead because of preventable illness, hunger, and other issues. So I think that experience kind of shapes how you think about the purpose of economic growth, the purpose of trade. There has to be a development aspect to it, and it creates different arguments that I don't think we're fully attuned to in Canada from some of the countries with whom we're dealing that struggle with food security, that struggle with oversupply being shipped to communities in the developing world. So it doesn't necessarily change your empathy. My sympathies and my empathies are to protect and promote Canadian interests first and foremost. But I think the most effective way to do that is to better understand the arguments on the other side, better understand how to come to agreements that will work and be more durable by understanding both sides of the argument and both sides of the coin. That applies to China. And this is where I think I differ with a lot of folks on China and the appreciation of lifting a billion people out of absolute poverty is something that I think shapes my thinking. Also about India and other countries where you have these tensions between poverty alleviation, I mean, absolute poverty, and you dealing with the necessary means to move people from poverty. It shapes your view. I think it makes it more holistic and more whole.
Yeah. I want to get back to your kind of big idea. So why do you think it is needed now at this moment?
Well, we go through periodic periods or epochs, I think, in global history that are defined by marked changes from periods that came before. Again, history rhymes, does not repeat, but in those rhymes can be, again, degrees of difference that are so profound as to mark a different era. And I think that's where we are now. We had a reset of the global rules-based trade system with Nixon in the 1970s, especially Canada, US. And I think we're under another one of those periods where the Americans are rewriting global rules of trade and doing so again in degrees of difference that are profound. So certainly for Canada, we know that we earn $2 out of every $3 in this country through exports. We are, I forget the figures, 3 times more export development dependent than the US, twice again as much as the Australians. So certainly for us, this is a major issue, almost existential. It's how we earn our living. So, the time is obviously needed now. I think we had a last swipe at it with the Dominique Barton report, the last of the attempts to operate under the old international trade regime. And we need to go back and revisit and update that, just as we need to go back and revisit our thinking about the U.S. to deal with the new era U.S. I again would draw the analogy and say that the same thing's needed for international trade and certainly ag trade. Does anyone think that the systems, the frameworks, the thinking that got us to this point will get us out of this point? That's the question you need to ask yourself as you think about whether or not to continue with this new era. Can you continue with degrees of change, marginal change, in an era where we're seeing large-scale change? So those are 2 questions. I mean, I could be wrong. I mean, it could be that the degrees aren't as large as I think they are. But I think nonetheless, that will only be tested through experimentation, and that can only be verified by trying new ideas for trade to see if we can outperform what's currently been done, what's currently being done, what's been done in the past.
Right. That jumps into the question I wanted to get back to on this active testing of these new ideas. So, what does that look like in practice or on the ground? Do you have an example or a few of how we could visualize what this change would look like?
Sure. So these ideas are obviously going to be different than what we're doing now. There'll be some degree of discomfort. There is testing. Testing of new ideas means just what it says, testing new ideas. Some of it is going to sound different, uncomfortable, but also there's a high degree of failure with testing. And you have to open yourself to the possibility that these ideas will fail. Again, in Silicon Valley, if you're not failing, you're not trying. That's how you get innovation. Move fast, break things. But that means that things get broken. So with that sort of favorable framing to pad the ideas, one idea we've been talking about is dealing with China. And I've published on this a couple places, but the idea of trying to remove agriculture from the political chessboard in terms of engaging with China. China faces food security challenges. And I think all of our listeners will know this well, no need to dive into it. But every 5-year plan discusses food security. China faces resource constraints in land, water, etc. And they're making massive global investments to increase the flow of agriculture and food products to benefit, well, China, obviously, but also to change the shape or of the global landscape and how we move agricultural products. So can we have conversations about China that center on our mutual shared interest around food? Set aside the rest of the relationship for something that's critical to both of us, the export of food. So not to have EVs and canola in the same conversation, not to have beef and politics or other issues around security in the conversation. I don't know, but it's an interesting idea. Would China change its framework of, no, we have a comprehensive agreement, it's got to cover everything, and we're not going to segment things off? Would China be willing to have a conversation just about food, where they agree not to muck around with canola and other things in exchange for Canada saying, look, we are one of the only major food exporters never to have embargoed food, never to have used food as a weapon. The Americans, they've done it to you twice, including during the Great Famine when millions of people in China were dying of starvation. Canada continued to sell grain, and we suffered the wrath of the U.S. I mean, Diefenbaker and Kennedy almost coming to blows. The Americans threatening the nascent auto industry, et cetera, et cetera. So you've got Argentina, Russia, others doing the same thing. So could we strike a deal there? Rethinking, too, investing in agricultural trade policy would seem to be a simple one. I mean, how many people can you think of in academia that work on agricultural trade policy? Anyone?
Not many, not many. And I think, Carlo, it's an interesting, again, we work at a think tank. We like the idea of testing out new ideas, but one of the reasons why your idea is a big idea is because it effectively calls it, I'm going to say calls into question, recognizes, acknowledges that the fundamentals that have underpinned the success of much of Canadian agriculture are broken, right? So I think that your comment about move fast and break things is interesting in the context of like things I think are already broken. I think that's part of the reason why we're here. That's part of the premise of your conversation. But whenever what you're doing is calling into question how things have been for the last 30 years, the idea of testing out new ideas, putting new ideas out there is uncomfortable, and it's tough for people to want to do that. I'm curious as to whether or not you think kind of governments, academia, those people that, to your point, probably should be doing ag trade policy, but maybe aren't, are actually open to this idea of testing new ideas, right? If you went out and we tried to say, Okay, let's look at this new relationship with China. Do you think that the kind of the broader system is open to that yet? Like, can governments go out and do this without risking the ire of everybody involved?
No, I do not in any way, shape, or form think that this will be taken well, if taken at all. I expect it to be rejected, but it's got to start someplace. Canada has a certain complacency, peace, order, and good government. The West was founded in Canada by the crown coming first, and citizens following. You look south of the border, and it was just the opposite. Citizens went first, then the government followed. So there was a necessary spirit of risk-taking in establishing government. And these are myths. Obviously, the story is a lot more complex, a lot more nuanced, controversial on both sides. But these are the myths. And I think the myths impact the mindsets. And I just don't see the willingness in Canada for innovation in policy or risk taking and the ability to have failure. I see less and less of it in the US, but I see it even weaker in Canada. But will it ever come if we don't start having these conversations? The tendency is to throw up your hands and say, no, that's unrealistic. No, that's just not the way things are done. That's politically naive. And that condemns you to complacency. So if we're going to break that, it's folks like you at CAPI, Real Ag, Shaw, and others that are going to have to push back against that. I don't know if we can succeed, but I do know that if we don't try, we're guaranteed to failure.
And Carlo, how much of kind of your approach about this and kind of that recognition of the need to put new ideas out there to think about how do we do trade differently comes from, again, this view that the system today is broken and we need a new system, and how much of the reluctance to think about new ideas do you think comes from this view in other places that the system's not broken, this is just kind of a speed bump that, let's wait till the midterms, to the next election, to something in the United States, and we'll all go back to normal?
Yeah, I think you've hit it. It's the perception as to whether or not the system is broken. And I would argue that in a large degree, the system isn't broken enough. I mean, it allows people to continue in complacency. It dulls the need for thinking about experimentation and risk-taking. Things work just well enough that it kills that idea. You don't want to take the risk if you think there's a possibility that what you're doing may be good enough. And that's a question I don't know that we can answer. I don't know how much polling has been done about this. It would be interesting to do, not just polling, but focus groups. And we're developing a methodology with the North America Initiative to do iterative polling and focus groups to kind of test ideas. I don't think it's terribly new, but we want to use that to test American understanding of Canada and how to improve the relationship. But I just don't know. So we exist, you and I exist in circles where we discuss these things, where we think about systemic problems and change. We take a longer term view than question period. And that's difficult, I think, in Canada. We also just don't have the think tank community, the vibrant think tank community to enable these discussions. And a lot of the discussions that we do have in the think tank community run through the U.S. or run through U.S. think tanks. So this has been another issue in having a debate that reflects the reality of Canadian agriculture versus having an agriculture that's nicknamed the U.S. Department of Writing Checks to Farmers. So we have a different reality on the trade front. We've always been through this, the 50s, Diefenbaker and Kennedy, food for peace, all the issues we dealt with the Americans, the phase one deal with China that essentially shivved us in the back after we agreed not to talk to China in the Kuzma agreement. We have a different reality, yet we don't have the institutions in Canada to fully understand our reality and to articulate policies that reflect our reality.
So I want to get to thinking about the future and what I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of um, organizations like CAPI and University of Calgary, it being in circles thinking about kind of systemic change and systems thinking, like that's where it starts. But how does this change happen? I think you made it clear that government doesn't have kind of the ability at this point to think beyond that. Is it just organizations like CAPI that get that conversation out there to have that mindset shift, or what does it take to have this happen?
So I think it has to occur at the grassroots. And I was just in Speedy Creek, Swift Current, for those not from Saskatchewan, uh, meeting with a group of independent terminal operators. And I made the point to them that on issues around ag, for trade infrastructure, on ag policy, on building things in Canada that we need to move goods, on signing trade agreements. The support has to come from the grassroots because that's where the opposition comes from. That's where the intransigence comes from with politicians. And until we see the producers, until we see the companies that benefit from this business, whose business model is based on producing and moving goods, step up and demand change, I don't think you're going to influence the political environment, and you won't either with the politicians or with the public at large. I think about the pipeline deal between Alberta and the federal government, or I think about general ag issues where we sign trade agreements. The opposition to pipelines, the opposition to trade agreements are out 24/7. The NGOs, or NGOs, as we call them in Canada, the other activist organizations are committed and dedicated. If you're looking for a protest, you'll find them. But how many, other than the Chamber of Commerce in Calgary, I have yet to see real ground support, organized ground support coming out for the pipeline. And when I was at the terminal, I suggested to the board, you've got your director of HR here. Why don't you, when you hand out pay slips, hand out notices about the importance of ag, about the importance of trade infrastructure, about where that paycheck came from? You need the workers at the terminal. You need the farmers and the producers organized and informed, and they've got to get up off their asses, pardon me, but lose the complacency that I think starts at the farm gate. That requires social organization and movements, the type of work I did with international development, which is why I think I bring a slightly different perspective to this. But I see those opposed to what we're trying to do organized, prepared, funded, and operating, not just NGOs, but larger interests, corporate interests. But I don't see similar organization at the base amongst those whose livelihoods depend, and their communities that depend on this. And I don't know how we do this. I'm not a political organizer. I'm not a politician. I'm not going to go out and start a social movement.
So, Carlo, you don't have all the answers for us?
No, I'll give you problems.
Excellent. We love problems. That brought up
good with problems.
Yeah. That reminded me of the nutrient decision to route a product through Washington Port versus the Vancouver Port. And I'm wondering, is that an example of the grassroots seeing like nothing change? And maybe just weigh in a bit on that.
No, it was a business decision, rational pursuit of self-interest, value to shareholders. I mean, this is what we're built upon. This is what we want. So it also just may be a bargaining ploy, or it may reflect deeper realities of trouble that we have with trade infrastructure, capacity at the ports, capacity on the southern route, the rail line in Canada. It may reflect those issues. I don't know that I'd read too much into that at this point. But again, we should have a note here. I do agricultural work on the side of my desk. I do it because I spend a lot of time in agriculture. I love driving out and talking in rural communities to farmers and producer organizations. I mean, I shouldn't have gone to Swift Current. I mean, it cost me time that I need to do other things, but I just really enjoy it. But that's not how you want ag trade policy done. You don't want someone doing it off the frigging side of their desk because they're passionate about it. You need people working on it full time in a concentrated manner. And I would say that's an issue that we face here in academia. My question about who does ag trade policy. I mean, if I'm one of the people doing ag trade policy, then this country's in serious, serious trouble.
Well, and just briefly on that, Carlo, it is like worth noting that we don't have that is not a priority that we are investing significant resources in today, in part because there are a lot of people, a lot of voices in agriculture on trade, but it's hard to find them that I think that are thinking in this kind of longer term, different context, like what you're talking about, and like when we do think about trade, and when we do work on trade, like we try and think about it, we don't see that playing out. But I mean, is one of the barriers to kind of that testing new ideas, taking a different approach to manage trade, is one of the barriers not the fact that when companies are investing in trade infrastructure, they're doing it in the United States. We've got a federal government that's trying to make trade infrastructure a bigger priority. We saw this in the budget, a new trade transportation corridors fund where they're committing to spend $5 billion. If we want to pursue those new markets, if we want to make ourselves a more reliable trader with the Asia Pacific, do we need to figure out this trade piece? And yet, kind of in spite of all of this, we see that business investment encouraging, or that business investment going down to the United States. Is it not a symptom that we've got a long way to go before we cure this disease that we have?
Yes, we also have structural issues in terms of, as you mentioned, the U.S. investment going to the U.S. And when we've built a trade transportation system that's focused on north-south, largest markets, closest by, larger set of assets, including coastline where you can build ports. Where are you going to build another port on the Canadian Pacific coast? Where you can put in another rail line? I get really frustrated. I remember I was at Campotex a while ago and talking about the complexities of trade infrastructure and how we had to think about national planning. And the response I got was, I don't want to hear it. Just tell me that you're going to get another rail line built or another port built. That's the only thing I want to hear. It's like, geez, man, if it was that simple, we would have friggin' done it decades ago. But that's, I think folks are frustrated, to be fair. But no, we have structural issues. We have an inability to build trade infrastructure because of the way we built it in the past. You would go to certain communities of longstanding Canadians from, I don't know, largest country in Asia and ask them about the history of building major infrastructure, ask First Nations. To some degrees, we're living with the sins of the past today as well. So all these factors contribute in varying degrees to our difficulties.
And Carlo, do they not also contribute to the barriers to change, right? When we think about that idea of we need to go out and test new ideas and think differently and kind of understand that we're in this world of managed trade, which is not the world of the last 30 years of trade policy. Is one of the issues not that we run into kind of the decisions made over the last 30 years, whether or not it's trade infrastructure or the lack thereof, whether or not it's the fact that we're more concentrated in the US market today than we were 20 years ago? Is it not the fact that we've got kind of but limited federal capacity? Our market access negotiators, don't have the same resources that their counterparts in the US or Australia or many other kind of export-oriented countries do. Do we not just run into these kind of walls over and over and over again? How do we deal with that as a barrier to change?
So you're absolutely right. These are systemic issues and they're systems we've built based on decisions and investments. Some of those investments, such as hard assets, have durations that last generations. And it's, you can turn the QE too slowly, but some of these investments you can't turn. So we do have to frame the calls for change and testing of ideas within the reality, some of them physical as a built infrastructure. But if you can make changes where you can make changes. So think about not trying to change the entire system or tilting at windmills, but are there opportunities to engender change? With trade infrastructure, back at Canada West, we laid out how to conduct national trade infrastructure planning. Eminently doable, would make significant improvements, understanding the integrated supply and production networks in Canada, how those tie to transportation assets, and begin to engage in planning how investments and changes impact the entire integrated supply and production network. That's eminently doable. You may not be able to build a new port, but can you get greater efficiencies out of what you have? So I think you have to look at opportunistic steps and build momentum for change. But you certainly have to take the low-hanging fruit, better use of existing trade agreements. Why aren't we using the full potential of the CPTPP? You have a multilateral agreement that allows for production and supply chains that span across several different economies with one set of rules. Why haven't we changed our thinking from bilateral? Let's sign an agreement with yet another country and create yet another set of rules for a marginal reduction in tariffs. Why haven't we changed our thinking to reflect the reality of multilateral agreements? Why haven't we pushed to join RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which opens markets? Instead, we go by agreement by agreement by agreement that creates more rules, more confusion, but gives you great photo ops, gives you great press announcements, gets to show progress. So I know there are opportunities. Things like taking better advantage of trade agreements, rethinking how we do trade from bilateral to multi-party or multilateral. There are things that can be done, but there are other things that will be a lot more difficult, or if not impossible. But don't let the enormity of the challenge dissuade you from taking the first steps.
So Carlo, that was a bit of an emotional roller coaster. You started off talking about the opportunities that are out there. Then you seem to go to, but look at, there are these big issues and we don't take this seriously and we need to act differently. And then you ended up on that opportunistic note again at the end. 5 years from now, Carlo, what do you think actually is going to be different at the end of the day?
Oh man, if I knew that, I wouldn't be here talking to you. I'd be on the beach in Monaco or someplace nice. Look, what would I think? Canada's superpower as a country, its gift to the world, is its ability to muddle through. So I really fear that that's what we'll do. It really is a superpower. I'm constantly amazed at how we manage to muddle through situations. I think that there is a path to muddle through this, where we have a slow decline as opposed to precipitous fall, but slow incremental decline in terms of trade infrastructure reliability, in terms of being able to take advantage of trade agreements, and that we lose the momentum that the emergency with the U.S. has given us. And already you're starting to see it with pushback on the Major Projects Office. The Globe had a great piece about, well, yeah, if you look at who's in the office and you look at the groups with whom they're dealing, you're wondering why these groups are nervous about a set of elite policymakers, elite from the private sector, dictating terms for how things built. So this stuff is hard. It's not easy. And I don't know with the Major Projects Office how that's going to work because of it. But again, if you're going to experiment, if you're going to take risks, well, then you're going to have these sorts of issues. So for me, I can't complain about things like that. I can only encourage ongoing experimentation, which means you try an idea like the Major Projects Office, You see how it lands, and then you continuously tweak it. It is a never-ending process of experimentation, testing, responding to the test, adjusting, and continuing to move. I think if we can get that, if we can revive that spirit in Canadians, or maybe bring that spirit to Canada, we certainly, speaking from Alberta, it's not a strange thing to talk like this. But if we can get that to enter Ottawa and Central Canada a bit more, BC too, that would be an incredibly valuable asset for the turbulent generational era of change in which we're entering, I think, only the beginning phase.
Yeah. Well, Carlo, we've covered a lot today. And you might have already answered this question with your answer to Tyler's last question, but our last question for our guests is, what is one thing you want people to take away? So just one thing from our conversation today that you want to leave our listeners with.
Sure. That we are entering an era of generational change. This is not Donald Trump in the US. It's a movement. And the man is not the movement. The movement will outlast Donald Trump. I think the era of global change, too, the distrust of organizations like the WTO by the Americans, but also by several developing countries, countries that now have the resources and ability to articulate their differences. We're going through an era of generational change. We can, I think, survive this. We can potentially even benefit from this. But we've got to wrap our heads around first that this era of change is occurring. We can't just bury our heads. Now remember, sorry, get the Keystone agricultural producers. I was talking with them about the U.S. They're an example of folks that got together and said, look, we need to talk about this change. We need to start reacting. So that's a positive sign, the folks at CAP. But on the call, there were several folks that were convinced that Donald Trump wasn't going to impose tariffs. This was back in January. And we've had that mentality that, well, no, this will pass. The U.S. has changed. We've gone through global change before. So my big point is that this is not going to blow over. This is not Trump. It's a movement, not a man. We're looking at generational change in the U.S. We have no idea what's coming on the left. Progressive Democrats, we have no idea what's coming on the left in the U.S. But I would take the America to internationally. I would argue that we're experiencing similar change, and we've got to start preparing for it. Look, our complacency with the U.S., oh, Donald Trump's never going to impose tariffs. It's irrational. No one would inflict self-harm. We read that completely wrong, and look where it got us. So that sort of complacency of thinking, not realizing the change, I think is the issue. And that's what I want to get people to take away. But also that we can do something about this. We can start becoming more proactive in trade. We can make investments to really think through the new era and move from being reactive to start being proactive.
Carlo, that is a great note to end on and echoes many of the things that we say and do and talk about every day. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Well, I appreciate you guys doing this. I mean, in terms of light in the darkness. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Have a great day. Well, Elise, what did you think of that conversation today?
Well, I thought it was really interesting and ran through a lot, but one of the things that really stuck with me was Carlo's experience in school and the Future Farmers of America, and just even related to, his big idea for a more managed trade policy, how concurrently to that, it is important to make sure that the next generation views agriculture as a priority and not something, I think he had said, ag is present and not something to be left behind. And I think there's a lot of organizations in Canada doing that. And I just applaud them for that effort, and just think that that's something that we can be thinking about as we're talking about these big discussions in the policy space. How do we build up that next generation to be thinking about these problems in a systemic way versus the way things are being done right now. I think there's a big opportunity there.
And I think that part of that opportunity is an interesting one given the premise of kind of Carlo's position on trade, right? Part of that premise is how things have worked for the last 30 years is not how things are going to work for the next 30 years. And so all of us that have been in ag and kind of come up through that traditional ag kind of development chain of whatever you want to call it with, an ag economics faculty, probably grew up on a farm, probably were a 4-H kid, all of these things. Our way of thinking is rooted in the last 30 years, and our way of thinking is rooted in how things have worked for Canadian agriculture. And there is probably quite a bit of reluctance to change. But one of the benefits of people that are coming from outside of agriculture, like Carlo, like yourself, is that you see the world differently, right? And you don't think in that same bias as we do. And as Carlo points out, we need today people coming forward with new ideas and new ways of thinking, and we need to test those ideas and we need to beat those ideas around. And hopefully by doing that, we'll come up with better ideas that'll help us survive the next 30 years.
Yeah. One of the other things I was struck with that I liked his honesty, is that, he was saying we can try, we should try, we won't succeed with the structures that we have right now, but we're going to be worse off if we don't try. And where we will land will be better off than we will try. I'm having a hard time reconciling what kind of that failure and response to failure, especially if it's a government policy being put forward, will look like from, a Canadian standpoint. I don't know if you had thoughts on that, but that's something that I'll be wrestling with.
Yeah, I really think that one of the problems that we have today is that when you look at where the federal government in particular and the new prime minister are taking risks, are trying different things, I think that there's spaces where they understand what the risks are, and they know that they're trying something different, they're doing something different, and they kind of know the consequences of that and are prepared to take them. And I worry at times that part of our issue in agriculture is that people don't actually know, like those that are in government, those at the kind of the bureaucracy and at the political level, inside the government caucus, maybe just don't know enough about kind of the sector and the dynamics in the sector to take those risks and try those different things and push forward. And maybe kind of averse to failure. I think that's one of the, like, action is hard. You get kind of the system that works against you. You've got the sprawling federal bureaucracy that is kind of risk averse and slow to move. You've got, again, in the kind of major project space, you've got provinces and you've got First Nations, and you've got all of these kind of systems that are there that don't make it easy to do big things in Canada. In agriculture, we've got an FPT dynamic that's a barrier. We've got these kind of long vested interests. We've got this very traditional risk adverse, at least from a policy perspective, set of farmers across the country. Farmers take risks on their farm every day, but tend to be pretty risk averse when it comes to policy change. And so, being able to do something different and to take those risks and try something new seems to be really hard. And I think that that's partly because, if you're going to try something new, you need to really, I think, have a good understanding of what are the consequences of what you're trying, and you need to be prepared to embrace them. So I'm just not sure that we're in a world today where people are ready for that, unfortunately.
It kind of brings up the Carlo's argument that this change needs to come from a grassroots level. Do you agree with that? I think what you're saying is going alongside that as well.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, sorry, I guess I'm of two minds. Yes, ideally it would come from the grassroots. It would come from producers and farmers and farm groups saying, look, at how things are today isn't good enough in the future. It would come from farmers going, I'm thinking ahead about the next 10 years and I'm worried. I'm worried about my farm financial situation. I'm worried about the markets I'm selling my crops into. I'm worried about the supply chains that are producing the inputs that I need to be productive and profitable. I'm worried about the weather and what it's going to mean for my ability to produce food. I think that those worries, farmers thinking about what the next 10 years is going to look like, should drive them to push change. But I think farmers also tend to be a very traditional, risk adverse, like small c conservative group, and aren't always keen to try different things. And that's where I think that then you do need some political leadership, and you do need governments to be able to take calculated political risks when it comes to agriculture. And that trying to find that right balance between grassroots and changes coming from the bottom and political leadership when that change doesn't come is a tough space to find, a tough tightrope to walk.
I think that's a great spot to end off. So I want to thank our listeners for joining us. And if you have any big ideas yourself, we want to hear from you. So please contact us if you have any big idea for change in Canadian agriculture.
Thank you for tuning in to Cappy's Ag Policy Connection, a podcast where we talk about the big ideas and fresh thinking needed to solve the big challenges and seize the big opportunities facing Canadian agriculture and food. Thank you to Carlo Dade from the University of Calgary for joining us. And thank you to Elise.
Thanks, Tyler. We'll see you next time.